For Nietzsche, art is not decoration, entertainment, or cultural luxury. It is a metaphysical necessity, one of the few human responses capable of justifying existence without lying about it. This conviction runs through all of Nietzsche's work, but nowhere more forcefully than in his reflections on art and music. Nietzsche believed that existence, taken honestly, offers no inherent guarantee of meaning, justice, or fairness. Life includes suffering, loss, and randomness that cannot be rationally justified away. Philosophies that promise redemption, progress, or moral compensation often function, in his view, as emotional shelters rather than truths. Art occupies a different role. It does not explain suffering, it transforms it. This is why Nietzsche famously claimed that only as an aesthetic phenomenon is existence and the world eternally justified. The claim is not romantic, it is brutal. Without art, Nietzsche believed, life appears either intolerable or in need of metaphysical rescue. Art allows human beings to endure reality by giving it form, rhythm, and intensity, not by denying its cruelty, but by making it bearable. Crucially, art achieves this without appealing to morality. It does not tell us that suffering is deserved, meaningful, or redeemable. It shows it. And in showing it honestly, art can strengthen rather than pacify. For Nietzsche, the highest art does not console. It intensifies. It does not promise escape. It demands participation. This stance explains Nietzsche's hostility toward moralized art that exists to instruct, improve, or reassure. When art becomes a servant of morality, it loses its power to justify life. It becomes propaganda, therapy, or distraction. Nietzsche believed modern culture increasingly preferred these safer forms. Art was expected to be uplifting, redemptive, or socially responsible. Anything that disturbed was suspect. Nietzsche rejected this demand outright. Art, he believed, must be dangerous to remain honest. It must risk excess, discomfort, and misinterpretation. Otherwise, it collapses into decoration, pleasant, harmless, and ultimately empty. Understanding this position is essential before turning to Nietzsche's complicated relationship with music and with Richard Wagner. Nietzsche's admiration and eventual rejection of Wagner were not matters of taste. They were tests of this principle. Wagner mattered to Nietzsche because Wagner seemed to embody art's highest potential, and later, its most revealing failure. Art, for Nietzsche, was never optional. It was the difference between enduring life honestly and lying about it. Among all the arts, Nietzsche believed music occupied a unique and privileged position. It did not represent the world, it entered it. Where painting, sculpture, and language relied on images and concepts, music bypassed explanation entirely. It spoke directly to the body, the nerves, the rhythms of feeling. For Nietzsche, this made music the most honest art form. Music mattered because it did not pretend to justify life rationally. It did not offer arguments or moral lessons. It did not ask to be believed. It demanded to be experienced. In this sense, music aligned closely with the Dionysian drive, the force that dissolves individuality, overwhelms distance, and confronts life at its most intense. Nietzsche believed that philosophy often mistook clarity for truth. Concepts, arguments, and systems created the illusion of understanding, while leaving the deeper experience of existence untouched. Music exposed this illusion. It reached places language could not, joy, terror, longing, despair, without translating them into moral or intellectual categories. This is why Nietzsche distrusted art that tried to explain itself. When music became illustrative or programmatic, when it told listeners what to feel or why, it surrendered its power. True music, in Nietzsche's view, did not moralize experience. It intensified it. It did not instruct, it transformed. Music also revealed something Nietzsche thought modern culture was losing, the ability to endure intensity without explanation. In earlier cultures, music functioned ritually. It was collective, immersive, and physically demanding. Modern music increasingly became something consumed passively, background noise, emotional regulation, or sentimental comfort. Nietzsche feared this shift. When music becomes a tool for emotional management rather than confrontation, it mirrors the broader cultural tendency toward consolation. Art no longer challenges, it soothes. And what soothes too reliably weakens the capacity to face life without illusion. This is why Nietzsche was initially drawn to Wagner's music. Wagner's early compositions did not comfort. They overwhelmed. They dissolved the listener into sound, rhythm, and myth. They demanded surrender rather than analysis. In Wagner, Nietzsche thought he had found a composer who understood music's metaphysical role, not as ornament, but as existential force. But this belief would not survive. Nietzsche would eventually conclude that even music could be corrupted, that its power to bypass reason made it especially vulnerable to manipulation. When music begins to serve morality, ideology, or mass sentiment, its intensity becomes a tool of pacification rather than affirmation. Music, then, was never neutral for Nietzsche. It revealed whether a culture was strong enough to endure experience without explanation, or whether it needed art to lie on its behalf. When Nietzsche first encountered Wagner's music, he believed he had found something extraordinarily rare, an artist capable of resisting modern culture's drift towards superficiality, moral reassurance, and intellectual fatigue. Wagner appeared to offer not entertainment but confrontation, an art form strong enough to carry the weight that religion and philosophy no longer could. Nietzsche's admiration for Wagner was not primarily musical. It was cultural. Wagner's operas seemed to revive the tragic function Nietzsche had identified in ancient Greece. They fused myth, music, and drama into a total experience that overwhelmed the listener and dissolved ordinary individuality. In Wagner's early works, Nietzsche thought he saw a return of Dionysian depth, disciplined by Apollonian form. Wagner's art mattered because it was unapologetically demanding. It required attention, endurance, and submission to intensity. It did not flatter the audience, it exhausted them. For Nietzsche, this was a sign of strength. A culture that could endure such art had not yet surrendered to comfort. Nietzsche also believed Wagner understood something modern culture had forgotten, that art must create meaning rather than explain it. Wagner did not offer moral lessons or philosophical arguments. He staged conflicts that could not be resolved intellectually. Fate, guilt, sacrifice, and destruction were not problems to be solved, but realities to be endured. This aligned perfectly with Nietzsche's tragic vision. At a personal level, Wagner represented hope. Nietzsche saw in him a rare ally, someone willing to resist the mediocrity of modern taste and the flattening pressure of mass culture. Wagner's circle felt like a countercultural enclave, a place where greatness was still possible. Nietzsche believed that through Wagner, German culture might escape both shallow Enlightenment optimism and sentimental romanticism. This hope explains the intensity of Nietzsche's later disappointment. Wagner mattered because he seemed to succeed where almost everyone else had failed. He was not merely another composer. He was a test case. If Wagner could sustain tragic art in the modern world, Nietzsche believed, culture might still be salvageable. At this stage, Nietzsche did not yet see Wagner as corrupted. He saw him as dangerous in the best sense, capable of shaking modern audiences out of complacency. Wagner embodied the possibility that art could still justify existence without resorting to morality or illusion. That belief would not last, but its collapse would teach Nietzsche something crucial about modernity and about the seductive power of success itself. Nietzsche's eventual rejection of Wagner was not a change of taste, but a change of diagnosis. Wagner did not simply disappoint Nietzsche as an artist. He revealed something disturbing about modern culture itself. What Nietzsche came to see in Wagner was not resistance to decadence, but its most sophisticated expression. As Wagner's fame grew, so did his dependence on the audience he once challenged. His music became increasingly theatrical, emotionally manipulative, and morally laden. Nietzsche began to suspect that Wagner was no longer intensifying experience, but engineering it, guiding listeners toward predetermined emotional conclusions. Music, which had once overwhelmed honestly, now instructed covertly. The turning point for Nietzsche was Wagner's embrace of Christian symbolism and moral redemption, most clearly expressed in Parsifal. What had once been tragic confrontation gave way to salvation narratives. Suffering was no longer something to be endured and affirmed, but something to be redeemed, purified, and morally justified. For Nietzsche, this was a betrayal of art's deepest function. Wagner, in Nietzsche's view, had discovered how to weaponize intensity. He used music's power to bypass reason in order to deliver moral reassurance directly to the nerves. The listener felt uplifted, redeemed, and morally aligned, not because they had confronted existence honestly, but because the music had carried them there without resistance. This was precisely what Nietzsche feared. At this point, Wagner ceased to be a cultural hope and became a cultural symptom. He exemplified how even great art could decay when it began to serve moral comfort rather than existential truth. Wagner's success confirmed Nietzsche's darkest suspicion. Modern audiences did not want tragic affirmation. They wanted emotional intoxication followed by moral relief. Nietzsche did not accuse Wagner of bad faith. On the contrary, he believed Wagner sincerely believed in what he was doing. But sincerity did not save Wagner's art. It made it more dangerous. The most effective forms of cultural manipulation are those that believe in themselves. This realization forced Nietzsche to abandon the hope that art alone could redeem modern culture. If even music, the most direct and powerful art, could be bent toward consolation and mass sentiment, then no art form was immune. The problem was not Wagner alone. It was the psychological needs of the age he served. Wagner taught Nietzsche a hard lesson. Modern culture rewards art that flatters weakness, sanctifies suffering, and disguises exhaustion as moral depth. Art that refuses this bargain will always struggle to survive. Nietzsche's break with Wagner sharpened one of his most important distinctions: the difference between art that affirms life and art that moralizes it. This distinction runs far beyond music. It becomes central to Nietzsche's critique of modern culture as a whole. For Nietzsche, morality and art operate according to fundamentally different logics. Morality judges. It divides the world into good and evil, right and wrong, permissible and forbidden. Art, at its highest level, does something else entirely. It suspends judgment. It presents life in its fullness, beauty and cruelty, joy and terror, without demanding that it be justified. When art submits to morality, Nietzsche believed it loses this power. Instead of confronting life honestly, it begins to instruct the audience how to feel. Suffering must now mean something. Pain must point toward redemption. Tragedy must resolve into uplift. Art becomes a vehicle for moral reassurance rather than existential confrontation. Nietzsche saw this moralization of art everywhere in modern culture. Art was increasingly expected to educate, improve, heal, or promote virtue. Works that disturbed or unsettled were accused of irresponsibility. Beauty was tolerated only when it served a moral end. This demand did not come from artists alone, but from audiences who no longer trusted themselves to endure experience without guidance. This is where Nietzsche's critique becomes uncomfortable. He did not believe moralized art was harmless. He believed it trained weakness. By offering emotional release without existential cost, it taught people to seek consolation rather than strength. Art that reassures replaces art that tests. Over time, this erodes a culture's capacity to face reality without illusion. Nietzsche's objection was not that morality is evil, but that morality becomes dangerous when it colonizes everything. Art, when subordinated to moral goals, becomes propaganda, even when its intentions are humane. It ceases to justify life aesthetically, and instead justifies life morally, which Nietzsche believed always involves denial. This distinction also explains why Nietzsche admired cruelty in art but rejected cruelty in life. Art can confront brutality honestly without endorsing it. Moral art, by contrast, often disguises cruelty behind righteous intentions. It teaches audiences how to feel correct rather than how to feel deeply. For Nietzsche, the task of art was not to make people better, it was to make life bearable without lying. Once art accepts moral supervision, it can no longer perform that task. It becomes safe, acceptable, and ultimately empty. The conflict between art and morality, then, is not a side issue in Nietzsche's thought. It is a fault line that reveals whether a culture still trusts art to confront existence or whether it needs art to protect it from the truth. Nietzsche did not believe that art declines because artists suddenly become less talented. He believed it declines because audiences change. As cultures grow tired, art is increasingly shaped not by what is demanding or dangerous, but by what is consumable, comforting, and widely acceptable. This is what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of the corruption of art by the masses. For Nietzsche, the masses were not defined by class or intelligence. They were defined psychologically. Mass audiences seek recognition rather than transformation. They want art to mirror their values, confirm their moral instincts, and soothe their anxieties. Art that unsettles or challenges them is experienced as hostile. Over time, artists adapt, not always consciously, to survive. This adaptation changes the function of art. Instead of intensifying life, art begins to manage emotion. Instead of confronting suffering, it regulates it. Music becomes sentimental. Drama becomes moral instruction. Literature becomes therapy. What once tested the audience now reassures it. Nietzsche believed this process was especially dangerous because it feels democratic. Art that reaches many people is praised as inclusive, humane, and socially responsible. Art that demands effort or endurance is accused of elitism. But for Nietzsche, this inversion signals decline. Great art has always been selective, not because it excludes arbitrarily, but because it demands capacities not everyone wishes to cultivate. This does not mean Nietzsche despised ordinary people. He despised lowered expectations. A culture that reshapes its art to avoid discomfort trains itself in avoidance. Over time, it loses the ability to endure intensity at all. What cannot be endured is condemned. What cannot be achieved is moralized against. Nietzsche saw Wagner's later success as a perfect example of this corruption. Wagner learned how to satisfy mass emotional needs without asking anything in return. His art delivered ecstasy, moral uplift, and redemption in a single package. The audience left feeling elevated without having faced anything difficult. For Nietzsche, this was not triumph, it was capitulation. Once art begins to serve mass psychology, Nietzsche believed it can no longer resist moralization or ideological capture. It becomes a tool for nationalism, religion, sentimentality, or moral signaling. The artist becomes a functionary. The audience becomes sovereign. For Nietzsche, this was catastrophic. Art was one of the last spaces where life could be affirmed without justification. When it falls to mass demand, that space collapses. What remains is entertainment, pleasant, ethical, and empty. The corruption of art by the masses, then, is not a conspiracy. It is a psychological outcome. When cultures fear intensity, they reshape art to protect themselves from it. And in doing so, they lose one of the few means they had to endure existence honestly. After Wagner, after tragedy, and after modern culture, Nietzsche's position on art becomes brutally clear. Art must do what morality, religion, and philosophy increasingly cannot: justify life without lying about it. Anything less is decoration, anything else is consolation. Nietzsche did not demand that art be pleasant, uplifting, or socially useful. He demanded that it be honest under pressure, honest about suffering, honest about desire, honest about cruelty, excess, and contradiction. Art that exists to reassure audiences, to moralize experience, or to regulate emotion fails this test, no matter how noble its intentions. What Nietzsche ultimately demanded was strength, not the strength to dominate, but the strength to endure intensity without retreat. Art, at its highest level, trains this capacity. It exposes human beings to experiences that cannot be justified or explained away, and asks them to remain present anyway. In doing so, art becomes a preparation for life itself. This is why Nietzsche believed great art would always be misunderstood and resisted. Cultures that prefer comfort to confrontation will experience such art as offensive, irresponsible, or dangerous. They will accuse it of immorality, elitism, or nihilism. Nietzsche accepted this as inevitable. Art that pleases everyone, he believed, pleases no one deeply. Nietzsche also understood that this demand was unsustainable at scale. Most people do not want art that tests them. They want art that confirms them. This is why great art is rare and fragile. It depends on a minority willing to endure what others avoid. Nietzsche did not see this as injustice. He saw it as reality. In the end, Nietzsche's view of art mirrors his view of life. Existence is not something to be justified morally or explained rationally. It is something to be affirmed aesthetically, not because it is fair, but because it is powerful, tragic, and real. Art is the space where this affirmation becomes possible. Nietzsche did not ask art to save humanity. He asked it to refuse to lie. That refusal for him was already a form of courage. Art, when it succeeds, does not tell us that life is good. It makes us strong enough to live it anyway.